Welcome again, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, part of the world you're tuning in from. Today is December 8th, and that means it's the fourth week of our class, but that also means that it's Rohatsu. It is the day on which Soto Zen tradition celebrates the enlightenment of the Buddha. It's a very, very celebratory day. Usually a little bleary-eyed because folks would have sat up most, if not all, of the night before. And in fact, usually there's a retreat that leads up to either a 5-day or 7-day, what we call sesshin, intensive retreat that leads up to the big celebration ceremonies on the morning of December 8th. After the Japanese and Koreans and various others Romanized the traditional Buddhist calendar. So, yeah, it's a beautiful day to be getting together and talking about Zen because it's a special day for Zen folks, and for all of us having received this gift of the Buddha's awakening all these many years later. So before I get started, I just want to say that so next week is our last week, and I have today, this afternoon, posted one of the 3 talks for next week. Some of you may know that I'm offering a virtual retreat this weekend, unrelated to this class. I'm offering a virtual retreat this weekend, so I'm not sure when those next 2 talks will get posted, whether they'll be up there by Sunday night or whether it will take me until Monday to get them up there, but they'll be up there soon enough. And also for next week's class, you may not have noticed yet, but there is a prompt that you could bring an expression of transmission or an expression of awakening. And by that, I would encourage you to do something creative, a poem or a painting or a photograph or some sort of a drawing, some object, you name it, whatever way you would like to. And it's of course optional, but it's just a fun way for us to explore what awakening means to you after having heard all of these stories of realization, and do so in a way that takes all the pressure off of finding the right words, So you can think about that between now and next week. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and give the recap for this week's 3 ancestors. And and there's one other thing that I did want to mention before I get started on the recap, which is for folks who are really very interested in the stories of the Chinese ancestors, Andy Ferguson has done a tremendous job of taking down, in some degree of clarity and academic rigor, I would say. He has collected many of the stories of the Chinese ancestors. A few of the women are in here. Many of the folks that are not, that we're not covering in the Denkoroku, and even folks who are not even mentioned in the Denkoroku. So just to show you, if you get a copy of the book, it's great because it comes with this lovely poster size depiction of what I was saying in the very first class, which is the Denkoroku is just picking out one part of this tree of many people who were the multiple successors of multiple teachers in Zen. So there's a lot more depth and breadth to what could be explored if it's of interest to you. Many of the koan stories are referenced in here as well. So it's Andy Ferguson's book titled Zen's Chinese Heritage. Zen's Chinese Heritage. It's not new, it's an older book, but highly recommend. Okay, looking at the Keizan Zenji's version of this. So today we're talking about Yaoshan, Yunyan, and Dongshan. And these are the folks whose names we see, at least Yaoshan and Yunyan, quite often in the Zen koan stories, in the koan collections. And so Yaoshan's story begins with an encounter with his master Shuto. And he asks this very sincere question. He says, I know all these teachings and yet I don't really understand them. And so Shuto says, being just so won't do, and not being so won't do either. And neither being so, or either being so, or not being so won't do either. So what about you? And Yaoshan didn't get it. So Shuto sends him to practice with Mazu. And this is the first time we're seeing this in Denkoroku, this recognition that folks did actually, at times, need to have many teacher relationships, multiple teacher relationships. They needed to find someone whose teaching fit their particular set of karmic circumstances, their particular mind and body. And so he goes to Mazu, and Mazu gives this famous statement about sometimes I make him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes, and sometimes I don't make him raise his eyebrows and blink his eyes. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not right. So I gave you a little bit of a flavor of the him there is you could say the activity of Buddha nature. And he's saying sometimes it's intentional, the way we manifest that, and other times it's just moving through us. And either way, both what we call subjectively right and wrong comes up there. It's not intrinsically right or wrong, that great creative activity of the world, of Buddha nature. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. We can talk more about that if that makes sense. Although I will say this exchange about if I were sitting idly, I'd actually be doing something. That's just such a classic, like smart Alex Zen student statement. But he's pointing again, right, at volition and intention and the difference between activity and inactivity and this other aspect that we're talking about of the principles of us ourselves as expressions of principles. Okay, Yunyan. For Yunyan, 20 years with Baizhang. 20 years with Baizhang. And there's this great story that he recounts. So he's been sent from Baizhang to Yaoshan because he kind of wasn't getting what Baizhang was handing out there. And yet, what Yaoshan does is he keeps eliciting from him, well, what was it that Baizhang was doing? Not because, I don't believe that it was because he was trying to explain that to Yunyan. It was more like he was giving, it's a checking question. It's like, what is it that you understood was going on there? So it's asking him to revisit, like, what was actually going on there? And so when he recounts this story of Baizhang sending the monastics away, right? This indication like, right, you are the full manifestation of Buddha nature. You just have to go and do your own work, you have to sit and realize that for yourself. But then also having compassion on them and saying, well, if I just send them all away, they might not get it. So he does this call and response, right? does this activity of call and response. And that is a classic, again, a very classic Zen teaching, also related to this way that we are built, our mechanisms of body and mind are such that we are inseparable from what we experience. That's what's meant by the not one, not two. And because we are built in that way, then we respond. Somebody calls and we turn and respond. But that response isn't seen for what it truly is, for what it the greater meaning of it, until you're able to realize how that pervades all things, how literally the house you live in is a response. The body you live in is a response. The mind you have is a response. So that's the meaning of Yunyan's story. And I really appreciate the way that we start to see, at least I feel like I start to see in these particular three stories, also the thread of how one master, like Yaoshan, struggling with the question of intentionality or not, it later, there are the shadows of that or echoes of that in what's happening with his students, in what he ultimately brings to the table that helps people wake up. So it's a beautiful way of seeing how we turn, each one of us is, by our practice, turning those things that we struggle with, turning our actual delusion and confusion and basically everything that we're practicing with, we're turning that into the offering for every single thing, every person that we interact with from that point forward. Once we've practiced with a thing, then that becomes the offering, whether we intend it or not, actually, because it's part of the way that we then experience the world. Okay, moving on. What else about Yunyan? It's in this story that Keizan on page 142 of the Cleary, acknowledges that you shouldn't think that just because somebody changes teachers that the first teacher was a bad teacher, right? That it has to do, again, with our karmic conditions and what works for us. And then Dongshan. So Dongshan, and I mentioned in the talk that many people believe that, so Chaodong is the way that it's pronounced in Chinese, the name of this school, Soto in Japanese, Chaodong in Chinese. And the Chaodong school was, according to many people, named after Dongshan and his student, Chaoshan. And because Dongshan was, and in fact, if you look at this Andy's chart, you see that he has color-coded the 5 houses of Zen, and he begins the color coding of the Soto house of Zen with Dongshan. But then other people, including my master, would say, no. Wei Neng's other name was Kaoshi, and his successor's other name had to do with Tong, let me see, whoop. Hold on, because I want you to have this information just because. Datong, whose actual name was Zenshu. But so other people, including my master, Sekihara Roshi, would say, no. Even though Dongshan was the beginning of the Soto lineage, that it was named after the sixth ancestor and the sixth ancestor's student. So it's a question for the history books, it's not something that I think is resolved. In fact, I looked and I don't think I've ever seen anywhere in Andy's book where he tries to resolve that question. Nonetheless, Dongshan was the beginning of the Soto lineage, as far as we know. And he has this question about inanimate things. What are the inanimate things? And who can hear the teaching? So in a way, I experience this as like his being concerned with, first of all, who's woken up, who gets it, but also this some kind of question of like understanding what's going on around you. Like, yeah. Anyway, it's, to me, that gets part of the reason why that gets resolved when he sees himself, his reflection in this dream, is because of this sense of having an understanding of the inner relationship between himself and the things around him, the environment around him. So that's part of what's being questioned here, or trying to get resolved. But so there's this interaction between him and Yunyan. And Yunyan is saying two things at the same time, as great teachers often do. He's saying, one, that the teaching of inanimate things means the principles, all the principles of the way that the world works. The Dhamma, essentially. That is the teaching of inanimate things, or insentient things. That said, so we as practitioners, when we realize the Dhamma, that's what that means. It means that we have had a visceral experience. We have attained it. We have tuned into that. We've seen it and known it in a very profound way. And yet we have to somehow then come off the seat of enlightenment, as the Buddha did so many years ago, and talk about the thing. So that's what Yunyan's saying when he says, if you don't hear me teaching, how much less will you hear the principles, right? So he's talking about both at the same time. He's saying you can't just set your eyes on understanding the principles and merging with suchness, right? As he says when he awakens, without having that be grounded right here in the subjective, without being able to then express it in some way. So I'm expressing it to you in this subjective conventional world right here, and you're not getting it. So how much less are you going to be able to penetrate that and shed your personal obstruction about it and know the suchness of it? So that's the conversation that they have. And Dongshan, he came very close to quitting. This leaving of Yunyan was like that. He was very, very distressed. And then when he asked Yunyan, what's your teaching? Yunyan stayed silent for a while. This is page 148 of the Cleary. And then said, just this is it. And the quote here, the translation here of Cleary, of Keizan Zenji's next statement is, and then Dongshan sank into thought. Sank into thought, right? He was flummoxed. He didn't understand. And he was disappointed, because to say just this is it is like saying you're never going to get anywhere. This is as good as it gets, buddy. That was how he was understanding that teaching, but that's not what that teaching means. What that teaching means is that thing you're looking for is you, is me, is right here in your face. It couldn't be anywhere else. Just this is it. You're looking at it. Right? You're looking at it. So there's this statement here by Keizan Zenji, people usually think that the inanimate things mean things like walls, pebbles, lamps, and pillars. But this is not what the teacher is saying. He is saying that there is this quote unquote mystic consciousness, and I really dislike this use of the word mystic here, in which the views of ordinariness and holiness are not divided. So I would say it's more like, and I don't want to get into a lot of Pali here, but I would say it's more like the consciousness element, or that which knows Buddha nature. So we have a lot of very juicy material tonight, and that is my recap. Yes, Dave.
So by consciousness element, you mean the Nibbana Dhatu?
The Vijnana Dhatu.
Okay, Vijnana Dhatu.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. So Dave asked, did I mean the Nibbana Dhatu? And this is, again, I don't want to go too much into the Pali, but and I said it meant instead the Vijnana Dhatu. So the Nibbana element is in my view, different than that, right? So the Nibbana element is the deathless itself. It's like the, yeah, it's hard to explain what that is, because that's how it's described as, right? The deathless that, which is completely beyond the sentient experience of human beings. But it is known, and that's the thing. That's the thing that I'm pointing to, and that I think Keizan is pointing to there. That ability of knowing the true nature of reality, which is something that is not constrained by the specific karmic conditions of this particular mind. So I hope that it's not too heady. I would like to check it out with you all, because these three stories, you know, they're very, you could say, kind of regular moments, right? Dongshan's walking around in the forest and he sees his reflection in the water. Or Baizhang saying, hey, you. Okay. Well, you could just go directly to your small groups and have a chat about something else. I don't know. Are there other questions or other things that want to be shared? You know, Dogen wrote an entire fascicle. Yes, Beth. Dogen wrote an entire chapter, by the way, of commentary on this exchange about insentient beings.
I have a question, and forgive me, I haven't gone through all of your talks. You might have mentioned it, but I was in the first one, Yashan, about non-doing. You know, it's like, oh, I'm not being idle, but not doing is not being idle. And I was wondering if that had something to do with the idea of equanimity and no longer creating any karma, whether good or bad. Would there be kind of a relation to that and what he's getting at?
Could be.
Could
I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it's definitely possible. Mhm. Yes, if he says, I'm not doing anything at all, right, then it could mean something like I'm just being in harmony. I am a thing that is in harmony with what is. So like that.
Yeah.
Which I think is related to what you're saying there, Beth, right? So Beth is in some way touching on the idea that beings who are awakened are, because that they have the full understanding of the nature of reality and the nature of the principles that are at work, then they are not creating any new, they're said to be not creating any new karma. So they are just that aligned with the karmic principles, that they're not creating any new karma. So that doesn't mean that they don't do things intentionally, because they do, but it means that even their intentional actions are karmically neutral. The one caveat to that would be that, the understanding of folks who have taken the Bodhisattva vow is that they would have one remaining, one remaining intentional act that is creating karma, and that would be the Bodhisattva vow, to continue to come back again even after awakening and aid beings in awakening too. So it depends, there are various interpretations of how that might work. Could the vow be more powerful than the sort of complete karmic alignment that happens at realization? That's how you would have to understand it in order for the Bodhisattva vow to be effective, right? Effective, meaning you would still come back again.
Yeah. It reminds me of those board games where you have to roll the exact number of.
Oh, yes.
Sometimes these games, there's a reason you're like, I'm not going to, I could easily end this, but I'm not because of something else. So kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's an interesting idea. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Ashley.
So in your video, when you talk about Dongshan seeing his reflection in the water, and you acknowledge that one of the things he understood in that moment was that the image was not separate from the water, much like we are not separate from Buddha nature. And I really like that example. And I was wondering if you had other examples, whether from these stories or just from real life, which personally is what I would find very helpful, like real life examples like that illustrate the same principle. Because sometimes it's very helpful to see real examples that illustrate these points.
Well, I mean, the classic example that I like to use, and the one that we talked about I think we talked about at the beginning of the class, and I was talking about again yesterday because of the Rohatsu, is this example of looking at the star, right? So when you see the star, even if you're not looking, right, you're looking up, and then the light of the star reaches your eye, then there is this very sort of mundane transformation in your body, in your mind, connection across time and space with that thing. Even if that star is already gone, right? We know that star may have already completely burnt out and become a black hole by now. But so in a sense, you could say, when you become aware that there is that bodily and mental change in you with any contact, the star, Patachara putting her lamp out, she sat down on the bed and she turned out the lamp, right? That's what she did. That's what we all do it every day. Huh? But we're not waking up. Why? Because there isn't the observation of how that very mechanism of the contact itself, it means non-separation from that thing. It doesn't, I'm not seeing on your face like a good aha going on. So,
Don't read my face. There's stuff
Maybe-
going on.
okay. Well, that's the example that comes up for me in terms of like an everyday way of thinking about it. Oftentimes there's this example of the mirror also, right? So the mirror mind, the mind that we can experience that is clear of the hindrances enough, right? That there is this very clear, this observation. That could also be it. But it has to do with that. It has to do, I would say, very, very kind of physically knowing. This is why the stories are told in this way, right? So the monk that saw or smelled the scent of the plum blossom, or the Kyogen, the monk that awoke at the sound of the pebble striking the bamboo. Like, what are these cues, right? The guy who awoke when he ripped his toenail off, sadly, on his way down the mountain because he was fed up with his teacher. Right? What are these cues? These are cues about moments of actual physical contact with some environmental stimulus that it was so intimate that you see the non-separation. You just see like, right? Like how this is all a set of dominoes going on. That's the best I can do there. Yes, Gareth, whose name is there as Red Clay Sangha. That's Gareth, for those of you who are not familiar with him.
Yeah, I forgot to. I was on something else earlier and I didn't log out and log back in. Sorry, confusing.
That's okay.
I forget which one of these guys it was, but one of them, their mother visited, and he ignored her, and then like the following
Dongshan.
Tuesday, she passed
That was
away.
Dongshan.
Following Tuesday, she passed away, and it's like, attaboy, well done. And then she showed back up in a dream a week later and said, "Thank you, son." It reminds me, actually, we were in a reading group last night, which none of the rest of you were involved in. Udana 1.8. When I tell you the story, you'll remember it, Dhammadeepa. Udana 1.8. There's one of these monastics. He's not a monastic, he's a renunciant. He's wandering around in the woods of northern India. He comes back to hang out with Buddha for a little bit. And it happens to be the village where his wife and child, who he left, are living. She comes to realize he's there, and she comes to visit him. And she brings her little infant in her arms and presents herself to him, and he completely ignores her. And she holds the child up, and the child cries, and all that stuff. And he completely ignores her. And then he leaves, she leaves, and Buddha says, "Attaboy, well done." And then he does the exclamation, which is admiring the fortitude of the monastic. So on the one side, yes, I completely grok the wisdom side of things that both of those stories are pointing to, and the practice side of non-attachment and so forth. But the flip of it is, in my heart, I can't separate compassion from wisdom. And there's a crying out there. There's a crying out that in those stories feels left behind. And yes, we train ourselves to allow our hearts to be broken again and again and again, but it feels like there's something missing in those stories for me.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. I think that both the story of Dongshan not replying to his mother and that story from the Udana are really, holding up the value and really the exhortation of how really committed we need to be in order to practice this way. How we really, really need to be completely focused in order to practice this way. And I felt the same way. I put a little down, sad face on the margin of that page, because I also feel like that kind of cutting off is actually not necessary. And it reminds me of another story, and you will know this one too, Gareth, and maybe some of you as well. Some other folks here will know this other story of, there was an old monastic that was in a hut, and it was being supported to practice by an old woman in the village. And she wanted to test him because she'd been supporting him for a long time. And by supporting him, meaning allowing him to have the hut, sending food, and taking care of his necessities. Yeah. And so she sends a young girl to go and tempt him, quote unquote, and see what happens. And the young girl approaches him and like strokes his arm or something, I think is what it says in the story. And he says something about the cold branch of the dead tree feels nothing or whatever. And so the young woman receives this reply, goes back to the old woman and tells her what happened. And the old woman says, "Oh, that guy has been fooling me all along." And she burns down his hut. She burns down his hut. Why? Because he didn't show compassion. He didn't, not that he should have, succumbed to whatever, advances might have been perceived, but rather that he should have taught her the Dhamma. He should have responded to her. He should have said, "Oh, here you are in this moment. Let's talk about this, or let's talk about Dhamma, or to show her some kind of wisdom and compassion about what potentially was going on for her." So I agree, Gareth. I think that it's unfortunate that that's being held up as a model for behavior. I much prefer the burning down hut story, which is saying the greatest wisdom includes compassion for living beings, right? It includes compassion for living beings and their needs, right? So when after the Buddha awoke, what did he do? He went back to the palace, right? And his wife said, "Well, what about your son's legacy? He won't have his father." And he said, "Okay, let him go forth then. Let him become a monk." And Rahula becomes a monk. That's his legacy. So he doesn't just shut the door. He doesn't say, "I'm never going to see my wife and son again." So I agree. I think that that's a very difficult story. And as I said in my comments on it, I wouldn't uphold that as an example for any of you. I don't do that. I don't hold that as an example for myself. I'm living here in Alexandria because my daughter is here, and I made the choice to be closer to my family. And I'm not living with her, and we have a different style of relationship now that I'm practicing the Vinaya, but that doesn't mean that I've cut her off in any form at all. Yeah. Yes, Margaret.
Conan, there's a story, and I don't remember the characters. There is a story in the Japanese tradition of a girl who becomes pregnant and claims that the priest or the monk up in the hill is the father. And
Yes.
the baby is taken to him, and he says, oh, is that so? And he takes care of the baby. And then sometime later she recants, and oh, is that so? And it's very, very cold. Darlene Cohen, whom I'm sure you know, retold that story because Darlene's child had a child
Mm.
outside of a marriage and brought the child to Darlene and her husband to care for. And Darlene took the child, and she told the story as if she and her husband were the monk on the hill. And they wept, and they struggled, and they had to get diapers, and they had to get food, and they fell in love with this little child, as this priest probably did, and they cared for it. And then the girl reconciled with the child's father or something like that, and the child had to be returned, as this priest had to return the child. And she said, and the answer was, oh, is that so? And then he went back, and he wept, and he gnashed his teeth, and everywhere he looked around, he saw memories of that small child that he had come to love. But he still took the child and cared for it without question, and returned the child without question. But the emotional context is so much greater and deeper. And she was telling it as a modern story, which it was, because she had lived through it. That was an exact parallel almost of this ancient story with the
Wow.
emotional overlay. And it made it so much more human.
Definitely.
We don't get that.
Yes. Yes. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I didn't know that Darlene had that experience, and that monk is Hakuin Zenji, one of the most revered Dhamma teachers, masters in the Rinzai lineage. So there's a story about Hakuin Zenji, and yes, I was always impressed that Hakuin Zenji did say, "Okay, I'll take the child." He didn't say, "No, this is not a monastery. This is a monastery. This is not a place." No, he took the child and took care of that child until the circumstances changed again. And I think the reason why it's told in this very cold way is, of course, that's part of Japanese culture, and it's also the sort of lesson that's there is that Hakuin Zenji didn't argue. He didn't say, "No, it wasn't me. I'm not the father. Blah, blah, go find your own, person to babysit your kid." He just didn't argue. He just received the situation with compassion and clarity. And then when the situation changed, then he received that situation with compassion and clarity. But it's beautiful to get some more context, because yes, I'm sure, you couldn't do such a thing without having feelings for that kid. And then having to give the kid back, it seems like a sad thing. Yeah. Okay, Gareth, one more comment before we send you off to your small groups.
This is a very quick one. This conversation turning this way made me think of a book, which I think is where I've seen that story most recently that you were talking about. The monk book burned down, which is, I think it's The Hidden Lamp, which is the Hidden Lamp. I think it is.
The Hidden Lamp.
And I just put it out there as, if people are interested in a more human side to koans, I'm going to go get that book and reread it. But that's what that brought for me.
That book is entirely by women. Yeah. But I heard Darlene tell the story, so I don't know whether she also wrote it up for that book. I don't remember it that way.
The story I was talking about was the one that Dhammadeepa said about burning down the hut. So I don't remember reading Darlene Cohen's story on there. But,
okay. But yes, I would agree that Darlene and various women teachers have been able to give us the koan stories with a degree of warmth and a degree of humor and insight that it's definitely worth reading in The Hidden Lamp. It's good. And The Hidden Lamp is also notable, not just because it was women's comments on stories about women in the Dhamma, but also because it's very cross-traditional. There are lots of different styles or traditions or lineages of Buddhism that are represented there in those stories in the Hidden Lamp. So definitely, I agree. I would recommend that one. All right, folks. So we are going to go to the small groups. And so the question for today was something about what do you do with the Dharma that you don't get? What do you do with a Dharma that you don't get? Which is a little different than what we talked about last week, or hopefully what you all talked about in your small groups last week. So last week, the question was about misunderstandings, and that was more about, you know, how we are seen in the world, perhaps different kinds of misunderstandings in that way. But you could talk about what to do with the Dharma that you don't get. And or related to that, you might speak about something about investigation. How do you do investigation in your practice? That is a little bit of a suggestion. And I think that because one or two people may be opting out, I am going to go ahead and just put you into 3 groups tonight. So let me see. That means one group might have 4 people in it. No, because I'm not going into my group. So then I'm only going to put you in 2 groups tonight. And then some people, it seems like I'm opting out and some other people are opting out, right? So then you'll have groups of 4. Does that make sense? Am I counting this right? Yes. Okay, great. You'll have groups of 4, and if more people opt out, then you'll still have 3. That's why I'm doing this, because if anybody else doesn't want to participate, then you'll still have 3 in your group and not 2. All right. So there you go. Breakout rooms. We're just going to do 2, assigning you automatically, and there you go. Yep. Okay. Off you go. Okay, wonderful. We're back. Did everybody get a chance to share? I saw that we had a pretty unbalanced rooms. Yes. Okay. So in 10 minutes or less, any other last questions or comments, things that came up in the sharing that you want to share with the whole group? This is always the quiet part of the evening. You've already had a chance to talk to each other. It's all resolved. Life is resolved. It's all good.
Well, we did all like having the exposure and the experience of of both Zen and the early Buddhism. So you're in the right place, teaching the
Okay.
right things.
Great. Hmm. All right. Well, let's see. So next week we're going to talk about Rujing and Dogen and Eijo. So we're looking at the transmission of the Dhamma from China to Japan. Rujing with a Chinese master. Dogen traveled to China to go practice with him. And that wasn't the first time that it happened, actually, but it was the time that's relevant to Keizan Zenji. So that's what we're going to look at. And as I said, in case some of you arrived a few minutes late for class, you'll have an opportunity to share some kind of creative expression of awakening or transmission or what the class has meant to you. And so just an invitation to some poetry or a painting, a drawing, a photo, some object, whatever is meaningful to you, you can bring it and share with the group. Instead of the small group, that's what we'll do next week. All right. All right, friends. Well, have a wonderful rest of the day of Bodhi Day, awakening, celebrating awakening, and have a beautiful rest, a beautiful week between now and next Thursday. And be well. See you soon. Good night. Good night.